Team, we're here to talk about aerobic training. For those of you in the CrossFit space, you'll typically refer to this as metabolic conditioning, but a lot of folks who don't do CrossFit, who perhaps just go to the gym or they partake in exercise, are probably doing some form of aerobic training. The idea of today's conversation is to talk about the concept of fatigue-based training versus sustainable and repeatable training. Now, fatigue-based training, as you can see from my beautiful graph here, is basically what most folks in the CrossFit space do. They see a metabolic conditioning session, for example, a 10-minute AMRAP or a 5 rounds for time, or a 21-15-9 descending type rep scheme. And what they do, they start off and they go really, really fast. They get to a point, usually around halfway through the workout, where they can no longer sustain their output. And what starts to happen is we see that their output starts to decrease. So they move slower and slower and slower. They start to rest more and more and more. And their RPE, their rate of perceived exertion, is going up the opposite way. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with this, and we'll talk about where that type of training is actually necessary. But from an improvement standpoint, what we're trying to really do when we're doing aerobic training is we're trying to improve over time. Now, we know, just like in weight training, the way to improve is we need to accumulate sub-maximal volume. This little graph is going to show you just how that kind of works. Take, for example, on the bottom here, let's say this athlete is doing 3 10-minute AMRAPs. Each 10-minute AMRAP has 5 minutes of rest in between each bout. Now you'll notice that what happens is that their output for each of the 10 minutes is exactly the same, as you can see by my detailed graph here. You'll see this little number on each graph is that the rate of perceived exertion in the first piece felt like a 6 out of 10. They did the exact same workout again 5 minutes later, but of course it felt a little bit harder because they weren't fully recovered at 7 out of 10. And they did the exact same pace again for their third piece. Even though they did the same amount of reps, same amount of rounds, it felt a little bit harder, an 8 out of 10. Now, what this person has now achieved in this training session is they've accumulated 30 minutes of really good quality training. They've stayed away from their threshold, and that's a win. Now we look at the top here. This is the fatigue-based training model where someone just goes a little bit too fast from the start. So in this case, they do their first 10-minute AMRAP, if we're using the same workout as an example, and they pushed way beyond their threshold. Now, all you need to know about your threshold is a point where you can no longer repeat and sustain that output. So at the end of that 10 minutes, you just simply cannot do any more. So they do the first 10-minute AMRAP and they push beyond their threshold. They have a 5-minute rest, and what happens now, because they've gone too hard to start, they're now no longer able to push at the same intensity. So the amount of reps and rounds they complete in round 2 has now decreased from the first round, yet it still felt like a 10 out of 10 effort. Then the third piece, they rest another 5 minutes, again, even more fatigue. They're now crawling through the workout, and as a result, they've achieved even less reps, even less rounds, but it's still a 10 out of 10 effort. Now, from a training standpoint, we know that in the bottom scenario, this person has accumulated 30 minutes of good quality training volume. This person has accumulated 10 minutes of good quality training volume. Now, in the long run, if this is how we attack every single metabolic conditioning session, where the goal is to improve our aerobic capacity, then you'll see that we're just not accumulating enough good time under tension, enough good quality work to actually improve. If every session you're doing 30 minutes of work, but only really getting 10 minutes good quality training, it's going to take you a really, really long time to progress, especially in the long run. Whereas this person who's always accumulating at least 30 minutes per training session, you can see how that's going to add up to a win in the long run. Another question you need to ask yourself is, do you actually need to be pushing past your threshold? It's a really good conversation. Now, for folks who are in the sport of CrossFit and they're trying to improve at the sport itself, maybe you're partaking in the CrossFit Open, maybe you're trying to get to compete in local and regional type events. Maybe you're trying to get to the higher level of CrossFit, in which case, yes, it is actually important that sometimes you do need to be pushing beyond your threshold. Why? Well, it's a facet of the sport. When you're in a competition and you're racing for time against other folks, you need to sometimes be pushing beyond that threshold and just hanging on for dear life, and sometimes at the expense of a decrease in output later on in a workout. But in the training year, we're not talking about competition here, is it valid? Well, I think it is, and that's really the difference between training versus testing. Now, it's important for folks who have a specific goal where perhaps competition is a part of it. And again, going back to what I just spoke about, competition meaning that you're going to have to sometimes push past your threshold. Number one, you need to constantly evaluate where your threshold is. Your threshold is going to differ based upon the stimulus of the workout, the time of the workout, the movements included in the workout, the loads, the repetitions that are prescribed. And if you're not every now and then pushing that threshold to identify, is this sustainable, repeatable work, you're never really going to know where that ceiling is. And I certainly have been guilty of doing this many times in the past. Other people have been guilty of doing it too many times. So training versus testing means that sometimes, you have to set up those workouts to push yourself deliberately to that threshold to identify where you're at and where your limits are at. If you spend too long out of that type of training, when you do get to competition, sometimes you're just really, really out of touch. With that said, if a sport is not one of your goals, perhaps you're using CrossFit training methodology as something to support you for life and for health, I would really put a big question mark as to whether this type of training has any real carryover into everyday life. Instead, what you guys should be doing is staying well below that threshold, which is going to be a little bit easier for you to recover and going to allow you to accumulate some really good quality training volume, which is going to contribute to a really strong, solid aerobic foundation.